the forgotten passenger. Into the shadows. Mark stood frozen on the gravel, staring at the old building ahead of him. The darkness surrounding the structure seemed thicker, almost alive, as if it was pulling him closer. His breath fogged in the cold night air, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back. But something deeper inside, whether it was curiosity or something darker, pushed him forward.
I shouldn't be here, but I can't leave. Not now!
He took a hesitant step toward the building. The gravel crunched under his feet, sounding far too loud in the oppressive silence. The car behind him felt like a distant memory, and the cold air seemed to grow heavier with each step. Mark could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, as if the darkness itself was watching. The front door of the building loomed before him, its wood rotting and splintered. Mark hesitated again, his hand hovering just inches away from the doorknob. He could feel the chill radiating off the door, colder than the night around him. His fingers trembled as he reached out.
What am I doing?
As soon as his fingers touched the doorknob, a low creak echoed from within the house. The door slowly swung open on its own, revealing nothing but pitch blackness inside. Mark swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest.
No! I can't do this!
But his legs moved on their own. He stepped across the threshold, and the cold darkness swallowed him whole. The dark hallway. The moment Mark crossed the threshold, it felt as though the world outside had been left behind. The air inside the building was thick and stale, carrying the scent of rot and damp wood. The darkness was almost tangible, pressing on him from all sides. He could barely see a few feet ahead, the dim light from the doorway quickly swallowed by the shadows. Mark hesitated, his breath shallow. He reached into his pocket for his phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a long hallway that stretched far beyond what seemed possible. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the wooden floorboards creaked ominously under his feet.
This can't be right! The building didn't look this big from outside.
He took a cautious step forward, the flashlight flickering slightly as he moved. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the floor beneath him. His heart raced as he scanned the hallway, half expecting something to jump out from the shadows. A door at the far end of the hall caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, the crack in the door revealing nothing but more darkness. Mark felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck.
I need to get out of here!
But his legs didn't move. Something, whether it was fear or morbid curiosity, kept him rooted to the spot. He stared at the door, the darkness behind it seeming to beckon him forward. Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed through the hallway, low and chilling, like a breath in his ear.
You're not alone.
Mark's heart jumped into his throat. He spun around, but there was no one behind him. The beam of his flashlight wavered as his hand shook. The doorway. Mark stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the whisper faded into the silence of the hallway. His hand gripped the flashlight tightly, the beam shaking slightly as he turned toward the half-open door at the end of the hall. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, like it was waiting for him to take the next step.
I need to get out of here, but what if there's something behind that door?
The silence around him was suffocating, broken only by the creak of the floorboards as he took a slow, hesitant step toward the door. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to turn back, but something deeper, more primal, pulled him forward. As he approached, the door creaked open a little more, as if inviting him in. Mark's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing. What could possibly be behind that door? The whisper replayed in his mind, "You're not alone." He reached out slowly, his hand trembling as it hovered just inches from the door. The wood was old, splintered, and cold to the touch. He hesitated, the fear building inside him like a storm. But he had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now.
I have to know.
With a deep breath, Mark pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. He stepped inside. The room was impossibly large, much larger than it should have been based on the size of the building. The air inside was thick, cold, and damp. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, twisting and shifting as if they were alive. And then, from the far end of the room, a figure slowly emerged from the darkness. Mark's heart stopped.
Who's there?
The figure moved closer, its features hidden by the shadows. It didn't speak, but Mark could feel its presence, cold, powerful, and ancient. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in, suffocating him with their weight. The confrontation. The figure moved closer, its presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread. Mark's hand shook, the beam from his flashlight barely holding steady as it flickered across the walls. The shadows seemed to thicken, closing in on him, while the figure remained a few steps away, its features still obscured by the darkness.
This can't be real. What is this place? Who are you?
The figure stopped, standing perfectly still in the middle of the room. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Suddenly, the figure spoke, a low, cold whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once.
You came looking for answers, but you already know the truth.
Mark's blood ran cold. The voice was chilling, like it was reaching deep into his mind. His flashlight flickered again, and for the briefest moment, the figure's face appeared, pale, lifeless, and familiar. It was the woman from the taxi, but she looked different now, hollow, like a ghost of her former self.
You! How?
Before he could finish, the figure moved closer, faster than he could react. It was inches from him now, its presence overwhelming. Mark stumbled backward, his flashlight falling to the ground and rolling away, casting wild shadows across the room.
You can't leave, not without her.
Mark's mind raced, panic clawing at his chest. The room seemed to spin around him, the shadows twisting and warping as the figure loomed over him. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps.
Who is her? What do you want from me?
The figure didn't answer. Instead, the shadows in the room began to shift again, and from the darkness, another shape began to emerge, a smaller, fainter figure. It was her, the passenger, but she was different now, too. Her form was fragile, like she was barely there, trapped between two worlds.
What have I done?
The revelation. Mark's heart raced as the two figures stood before him, one, the shadowy form of the woman from the taxi, her face lifeless and hollow, the other, a fainter, more fragile figure emerging from the darkness. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing in as the shadows seemed to pulse around him.
What is this? What are you?
The smaller figure stepped forward, her form flickering like a dying flame. As she moved closer, Mark could see her more clearly. This was the woman as she once was, before whatever dark force had consumed her. Her eyes were full of sorrow, her expression pleading.
Help me, please.
Mark stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The air in the room grew colder, the weight of the darkness pressing harder against him. He couldn't understand how these two versions of the same woman could exist, standing before him like fragments of a broken reality.
What do you want from me? I don't understand.
The shadowy figure, the hollow version of the woman, moved closer, her presence cold and oppressive. Her voice was like ice, cutting through the thick air.
You know the truth, Mark. You can't leave, not until it's done.
Mark's hands shook, and he tried to step back, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the floor. His eyes darted between the two women, the fragile, pleading version, and the hollow, threatening one. The weight of their gaze pressed down on him, suffocating him with the choice he had to make.
What truth? What do I have to do?
The room seemed to warp around him, the walls closing in, the darkness tightening its grip. He felt trapped, caught between two forces that were pulling him in opposite directions, one wanting his help, the other demanding something far more sinister. The final choice. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the air thick with shadows and fear. Mark stood frozen, his heart pounding as the two figures loomed before him, the fragile, sorrowful woman begging for his help, and the cold, lifeless shadow commanding his obedience.
I can't stay here, but I can't leave either. What am I supposed to do?
The shadowy figure moved closer, her presence suffocating. Her voice was a low, icy whisper that seemed to come from every corner of the room.
You belong here, Mark. You always have.
Mark's hands shook, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to run, to escape this nightmare, but the fragile woman's pleading eyes held him in place.
Please, don't leave me. I can't do this alone.
The weight of the choice pressed down on him, the room spinning around him as the walls seemed to close in tighter. He felt trapped between two forces, one pulling him toward darkness, the other desperately asking for his help. But time was running out. Mark took a shaky breath, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He had to choose, help the fragile woman escape whatever nightmare had consumed her, or stay trapped in this place forever, under the control of the shadowy figure.
I have to choose.
He looked at the fragile woman, her eyes filled with desperation, and then back at the shadowy figure, who stood silently, waiting for him to fall under her control. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the pressure building inside him. His hand reached out toward the fragile woman.
I'll help you.
As soon as his hand touched the fragile woman's, the room exploded with a blinding light. The shadows screamed, twisting and writhing as the darkness was ripped apart. The shadowy figure let out a piercing cry as she dissolved into the light, her form disintegrating into nothing. The fragile woman's hand tightened around Mark's, her form becoming more solid, more real. The room began to settle, the walls no longer closing in, and the oppressive darkness lifted.
Thank you.
Mark blinked, his vision clearing. The room was now empty, save for him and the fragile woman. The air was lighter, the fear that had gripped him finally releasing its hold. But deep inside, Mark knew this wasn't the end. There was more to this place, more that he didn't understand. But for now, he had made his choice.
What happens now?
The woman smiled weakly, her form flickering once more, before finally disappearing, leaving Mark alone in the room. The silence was deafening, but the shadows were gone. For now,